welcome everyone here for this evening. I believe it's going to be a fantastic evening with Ian Hall talking about, as Narendra Modi is the third term Prime Minister of India, as he reached his peak with a big question mark. So we all know Professor Ian Hall, and I've known him for this long time now. Probably it shows my age and his age too. Long time, but he is one of the guys who we can rely on to understand the politics in India. My take of Professor Ian would be to say, like, it's difficult to understand Indian politics, even coming from India. It changes so often, but he's taken a lot of time and effort to understand the politics, and you can get some wisdom out of him on the Australia-India relationship and the politics. And as you would know, he's an international relations professor in Griffith University. Plus, he's also an honorary member at the Indian Institute, the Australia-India Institute. And he's written a book, and he's also now trying to do a monograph on the Indo-Pacific grand strategy. Probably will ask him to explain more about it if it is relevant. But please welcome Professor Ian Hall to talk to us about Mr. Modi.
Thanks so much, Raj. That's a very kind introduction, and it is nice to see you. And it's nice to be back here in this room and in this forum as well. I'll start with an apology because I hold a British passport, and that's what British people always do when they give these talks. My apologies. I'm sorry that I don't come here more often and sit in the audience and listen. Yes, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Indian election, which has just passed. It does feel a little bit like it's ancient history, given that we've just had a UK election, given that we're going to go into a US presidential election soon. We've just had a French election. Were there any other elections? There was some shenanigans going on in New Caledonia recently. Where else? We've had elections all over the place. This has been one of the biggest year for democratic elections, I think, ever. Anyway, let's talk about the Indian election and what it means, what the implications are for Narendra Modi, who's been the Indian Prime Minister for the last 10 years, for the BJP, for his party, for India, and also I want to talk a little bit about the Indo-Pacific as well. So I'm going to rattle through some of the things that I think we learned from the election. I'm going to have a couple of little speculative things, and then I'm going to say a little bit about what we might look forward to in terms of where India might be heading, and in terms of where India's foreign policy might be heading, and what that all means for the Indo-Pacific and also for Australia-India relations and all of those sorts of things. All right, so let me start with some of the numbers and some of the facts. So I probably should point out this rather nice kind of poster here, just to point out the Australia-India angle. Of course, here you've got some fans of Narendra Modi referencing that famous remark that Anthony Albanese made in Sydney, that Modi was the boss. You can see that here on this poster, and it came up multiple times during the election campaign and was featured in some of the BJP's campaign literature and videos, especially. All right, so it was the largest election in the world. It was the largest election that India has ever held, simply on the basis of the number of voters that were registered. So around 970 million voters were registered. The turnout was a little bit lower, actually, than perhaps people were expecting, and that we've seen in the last couple of elections, around 66%. The other trend that we need to point out, because it's actually quite important, is that women's participation in Indian elections has risen fairly steadily over the last few years. And it's getting to the point now where we're seeing 50-50 in terms of turnout between men and women. 543 seats were contested, and the BJP won 240 of those seats. And it won around 36% of the vote or so. Now, of course, like the UK, and we've just seen the Labour Party win an election, a big landslide victory on about 35% or so of the vote. Like the UK, India has a first-past-the-post system, and that explains why you can be very dominant in Parliament and win significant majorities, but with only around 35, 36, 37% of the vote. In fact, no party has ever got more than 40% of the vote in a single election. But anyway, so the BJP got around the same vote that it got in 2014, 2019, got around the same proportion of the vote, but the number of its seats dropped down from 303 down to 240. Congress Party, the main opposition party, arguably the main opposition party in the last parliament, certainly now, won 99 seats, so it went up, almost doubled its number of seats, and the BJP's alliance as a whole won a good majority in parliament, but nowhere near the number of seats that they won in 2019 when there was a kind of surprise victory and they extended their margin over the opponents. Now, what was unexpected in all of this is the BJP went backward in a number of really important states. So I've highlighted some of those states now there. So in Rajasthan, Maharashtra, Uttar Pradesh, West Bengal. There are other places where the BJP didn't do so well. And in all of these places, arguably, these setbacks were unexpected. Why were they unexpected? Well, because those of us who've been watching the polls knew, supposedly, that the polls were all predicting a really significant victory for Modi. So Modi and the BJP had gone into the election saying that they wanted to win 400 seats. Okay, this time around, they were going to win 400 seats. And some of the polls that came out suggested that they were going to get quite close to that. So you can see here in this kind of saffron column here, appropriately coloured column, we can see here that these estimates of the vote share went from 373, 411, 378, 377. The lowest ones were in the 290s or so, but the highest ones managed to get even over 400. And you can see the consistency here in terms of the polls as well. They all overestimated the vote that the BJP and its alliance partners were going to get. So we had all gone into this expecting a big win for Modi, a big win for the BJP. That's not quite what eventuated. And we can see here that we were to some degree misled by the polls. Now, we should have known better because Indian election polls are notoriously unreliable. But the problem is they're unreliable in both directions. So in 2014, they completely underestimated the number of seats that the BJP and its alliance partners will win. And then in 2014, they overestimated and they overcompensated. So lots of work for the pollsters to do to try and get their methodologies a bit better. Perhaps they might learn from the British pollsters who got the election result almost exactly right, which was kind of interesting, with a similar kind of electoral system. Okay, so what else did we learn? So we can't trust the pundits either. Okay, so almost all the media pundits were out saying, maybe they're not going to get 400, but they're certainly going to get it in the high 300s. We're expecting another thumping victory for Modi, for the BJP, for the National Democratic Alliance, for the group. There was only really one or two pundits, and I've mentioned Janata there, who predicted that the BJP were going to get around 240 or so seats. And I well remember, I know I'm being recorded, so I have to be very diplomatic in how I phrase this. I well remember that prediction coming out and going down to Canberra and talking to somebody down there and saying to them, what if they do get 240 or 250? And the response that I got was, it's ridiculous, never going to happen, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to name that person. They know who they are. So only a couple of pundits got this right. Okay, so firstly, polls were wrong. Secondly, the pundits were wrong. What else did we learn from all of this? Did I just skip one? No, I didn't. What else did we learn? Well, fantastically, happily, for those of us who kind of been watching India's politics for some time, actually India's voters voted the way that they've done for quite a long time. So things have not changed as much as we might have expected in the last 10 years. The brilliant thing about Indian voters is that they are unpredictable, but they do show they have some tendencies, they have some habits over the long term. So They were voting unpredictably, but they were voting on what we might call substantive issues. Economic issues clearly dominated. So if we look at the exit poll data, we look at the surveys that have been done afterwards, we can see now that voters were thinking about the big economic questions. So they were thinking about whether their family themselves are seeing the effects of economic growth, whether they have a job, whether that job is a formal job and an ongoing job, whether the government has inflation under control. Those kinds of issues were dominating in a lot of voters' minds. The other thing, of course, we found out is that in rural areas, which has always been the case, in rural areas, the voters are very volatile. They like to move between parties quite a lot. This has been a long-term trend in Indian politics. They also like to kick out incumbents. So, there's that great phrase in Australian politics, particularly Queensland politics, that voters will be waiting with, baseball bats for the election to happen so that they can clobber whoever's the incumbent. In India, that is absolutely the case. This happens a lot, and we saw some sort of effect there as well, where people were shifting to the other side just to kind of give the incumbents a kick and to get them to perform, arguably. Or to bring in somebody else who might do the job better than the people who are doing the job at the moment. And two other things were really interesting. Regionalism was still a really big feature. Might come back to that in a second. And that caste issues still mattered as well in terms of the election. I might come back to that point in a minute, but we can come back to it also in questions because it's quite an important one in terms of the whole of Modi's project and the BJP project more broadly. So, what else did we learn? Identity politics. So, BJP obviously is described as a Hindu nationalist party or as a party that promotes a concept of Hindutva, Hinduness, that has a conception of Hinduism of its own, which it wishes to promote domestically and to some extent internationally as well. It wants to, in crude terms, consolidate the Hindu vote together into one bloc. And that would then give it a kind of lasting dominance of the political system. So what they tried to do in this election campaign, as they've done in other election campaigns as well, but what they tried to do in this particular election campaign is appeal to the Hindu vote as a collective. And they did that in a variety of different ways. One of the most eye-catching of which was to open this big temple in Ayodhya on this disputed site where there had been a mosque built in the 16th century prior to that, and of course that mosque was demolished in 1992. Now, so they built this temple. It was opened in January of this year, just before the election campaign started, and there was a huge campaign across India to try to consolidate Hindus behind this recreation of this Ram Mandir in Ayodhya, on the site, the supposed site of the birthplace of Ram. There were also a bunch of other things that were done. So there was a discussion about, I don't want to get too technical about this, a discussion about changing marriage laws, divorce laws, child custody laws, child support laws, and so on, which at the moment in India are specific to different religious communities. So different religious communities can kind of police these family issues or these social issues themselves. And that's been the case since India became independent. It's been the case actually since the British. What the BJP has wanted to do for a long period of time is to regularise those rules and regulations and laws around things like marriage and divorce and settlements for children and all this kind of stuff across all the communities, and to have one civil code for everyone. This is a controversial issue because it changes the order that's been in place in India for a significant period of time and is perceived as being anti-Muslim in the sense that the majority would then be imposing a civil code upon a minority community. So these issues were all floated during the election campaign. So when I was in India in whenever it was, February, March, There are lots and lots of little banners celebrating the Ram Mandir, but there were also all the bus shelters had pictures advocating for a uniform civil code, which they were arguing, quite interestingly, would be good for women in particular. So they're appealing deliberately to women's votes on this particular point. Anyway, what we saw though was that these appeals towards a kind of collective Hindu identity did not have the same purchase as perhaps the BJP thought it was going to be the case. And this was exposed to some degree as the opposition campaigned or put out a story saying that what the BJP wanted to do as part of this kind of broader consolidation project was remove some of the positive discrimination provisions that are put in place for lower caste groups in India. So that's what caste reservations are. So this story was put about by the opposition that the BJP was aiming at some point to change the constitution and to remove these positive discrimination schemes. And of course, this then got certain lower caste groups concerned. And what we saw was some of those groups moving away from the BJP and voting for other parties that represented their interests. So at both levels, in a sort of positive and negative sense, the identity appeals did not function the way that the BJP wanted them to do. Okay, so last thing on what we learned. The other thing that we learned was that this guy here, who is the dominant political force and political personality in India for the last decade or so, that Modi himself, his personal appeal, his appeal to voters, is not as strong as it was about 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. The BJP itself tested this really well by putting out a manifesto that was all about Modi. Not just all about Modi, it had 45 pictures of Modi. I think it was 45, I tried to count them all. There were very few other people featured in the manifesto. And the manifesto was called Modi's Guarantee. So this was all about him, all about Modi itself. It was all very much a personal campaign. But it seemed like voters just weren't as convinced anymore that Modi can get the job done. What does all this mean? Okay, so for nerdy political people like me, some quite interesting things. For a long time, India has been governed by coalitions since the 1980s, and state levels from before that. It seems now that coalition politics are back, and coalition politics are really interesting to political scientists like me because there's all sorts of interesting stuff that's going on, lots of horse trading, lots of sort of speculation, lots of gossip, all kinds of interesting things happen when you have coalition systems. You've also got the return of regional interests becoming very clear within the whole system, and we might be seeing the return of a more unstable centre within Indian politics, perhaps. This is doubly interesting for people like me because Modi is really unusual as an Indian leader in that he's never really had to manage these things. Pretty much every other Indian leader has had to manage a coalition, to juggle a coalition in some way, shape or form. But Modi's curious in the sense that he never had to do that really as chief minister in Gujarat, and he's never had to do it really properly at the centre either. So he's had a coalition, but the coalition partners have never been sufficiently empowered that he's actually had to pay much attention to the coalition parties. But now he's got coalition partners, and now he's also got coalition partners with regional interests dotted around India, and that he's going to have to pay attention to in order to make the system work. And the other thing is that the other two of the coalition partners are not signed up to the ideological identity politics agenda of the BJP. They have different interests and different focuses. Now, so what's Modi done in response? I think a rational strategy, but a strategy that will work for a while, but it might not work for too long. So one of the things that Modi did was he very quickly moved to reappoint most of the surviving cabinet ministers back into their positions again. So a few of them lost, some of the ministers lost their seats, but most of the core team were put back into their positions again. this is an experienced team, it's a reliable team, sends familiar faces, and so on. And he did this to reassure international partners. He also did it to reassure the financial markets, and I think he did it to project strength. Now, if you think the financial markets thing isn't important, let me just remind you that when the election happened, when the exit polls came out, just before the election results were announced, the stock market surged, yeah? And all of the big industrial conglomerates' share prices surged. And then when the election results started to come in on the day when they were announced, there was a big plunge in some of those conglomerate share prices. At one point, Adani Group's share price was down by 30-something%, and it stabilized later on in the day. But that was a big loss in terms of stock market value. So Modi had to come out and reassure the markets really quickly. The problem that he's got, though, in the longer term, is he's always tried to govern both in Gujarat and at the centre through his bureaucrats, through hand-picked officials that are loyal to him and that are very competent, and he's basically sidelined most of his ministers. And they're just kind of in ceremonial roles rather than kind of actual substantive roles. But now in a coalition government, he might have to pay more attention to the ministers and not just govern simply through the bureaucrats. Right. What else is going to happen? It's pretty clear from what I described before that some economic anxiety had driven voters away from the BJP. And that's going to mean that in order to win them back, the BJP is going to have to ramp up, particularly the social welfare schemes. So yes, it can get the economy going. Yes, it can hope that with creating more manufacturing jobs, for example, there'll be more stable jobs in the economy. But at the same time, they've got to deal with a lot of distress, particularly in rural areas. And it will take a decade or 2 decades to create enough jobs, say in manufacturing, to kind of suck up all that excess labour that India needs to deal with. But in the meantime, it's got to come up with some way of alleviating the distress that exists, particularly in the rural areas. So we're probably going to see a significant boost to welfare schemes. In fact, we've already seen that in the budget. There's going to be more spending on other things as well, things like infrastructure spending. The problem, though, for the longer term, is that what India probably needs is reform to its land use laws and to labour laws as well, which both areas they have very old, very clunky, very problematic laws in those areas. And the other area that needs substantive reform is agriculture itself. Really, we need to move over time towards a much more productive, much more efficient form of farming. And we need to deal with getting the crops off the land and into markets and in efficient kinds of ways. And now, the Modi government tried to do that before, and it failed. It provoked a big farmer protest and lots of opposition, which had all kinds of consequences. It could mean as well, just lastly, that some of the things like Uniform Civil Code could be set aside. Maybe. Or maybe not. And I'll say maybe not because historically, when Modi has been under pressure, he's tended to tap to the right, not to the centre. And in fact, he did that during the election campaign, where his rhetoric got markedly more anti-Muslim when it became clear that perhaps voters were moving away from the BJP. So that's one observation, which we can contest if you like. Okay, so what else is going to happen? Well, I think this is probably going to be Modi's last term, the BJP's last term, unless they can arrest this drift and unless they can address the economic distress that there is in the country. They need to get on top of inflation quickly, they need to create jobs, and they need to make growth more equitable. Because at the moment, there's a lot of very rich people at the top of Indian society getting even richer, and there's a lot of people down the bottom who slowly but surely getting a little bit richer, but then not be able to fulfill their aspirations. The other thing that we're going to see, I think, the other issue here is that the reason why the BJP came into power in 2014 and the reason why it stayed in power in 2019 and arguably the reason why it stayed in power again in 2024 is Modi himself. And the perception that Modi is capable, is that he's not corrupt, that he's successful, that he shares the aspirations of the people, that he's a great admired leader and respected in the world, all of those sorts of things. But if voters get turned off Modi over time, then that factor fades and the BJP fades back to its kind of natural position within Indian politics, which is that it can't form government itself on its own without substantial coalition partners. So if Modi's appeal is fading outside in the public, that's a problem. But Modi's appeal, obviously, inside is also a problem because, and this is like court gossip, so you can take this for whatever you want. But the court gossip is Modi's ministers don't like him at all because he's sidelined them and pushed them and ignored them and doesn't work through them and certainly doesn't work with them. Okay, so what does all this mean? Just very quick. I think the one thing that we can say is that we're going to see probably more continuity than change, right? And that's kind of a boring finding. I'm sorry about that. Can't come up with anything more entertaining. Partly we can say this because the same people are back in the same jobs. So Dr. Jaishankar is back as the External Affairs Minister, as the Foreign Minister. They put in place a new team within the Ministry of External Affairs. At the top of the Ministry of External Affairs, there's been some changes just because of people retiring and moving on and doing other things. But still, what we're seeing is a kind of is people handpicked for positions who are competent and loyal to Jaishankar, to the government more broadly, as very much a handpicked talent across the official space. The big question is who is going to replace the National Security Advisor, Ajit Doval, you can see here on the right. He is getting old. And I know we now live in a world in which you can be president when you're 81 and perhaps 91, 101, but nevertheless, he was speculating. He gave an interview to a newspaper just before the election in which he said that maybe the time was coming when he wanted to spend a bit more time with his grandchildren. And this has obviously given rise to lots of speculation that he's going to stand down at some point soon. So the one big question that's been unanswered here is that Modi has really dominated Indian foreign policy for the last decade, and he's doing that today, as we're seeing in Moscow. But the big question is whether he might take a step back and let others take the lead as he tries to tackle some of the domestic policy issues. What else then does this mean? I think the other thing to point out is not only is there continuity and not really change, but also that there's not really a lot of disagreements across the two major parties in terms of Indian foreign policy and where India sits on the big issues like China. So yes, it's true that Rahul Gandhi, the Congress leader, has criticized Modi over his handling of China and specifically his handling of the alleged loss of substantial amounts of territory in 2020 to the Chinese People's Liberation Army, leading up to this very nasty clash that we saw at Galwan in June of 2020, where a significant number of people were killed for the first time in 50 years on the line of actual control between these two countries. There is actually, though, quite a lot of consensus across the two major parties around a new approach which has been put in place since 2020. That new approach involves what Jaishankar has called conscious constraints on cooperation. I think it's a great phrase, not just for the alliteration, where essentially India has pulled back from working with China across, not just bilaterally, but across a whole range of other minilateral and multilateral organizations. So I'm just finishing a paper at the moment that looks at what India has been doing to obstruct, frustrate, annoy, and block China in various different forums, whether that's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, whether it's BRICS, whether it's the G20, whether it's a whole range of different things like that. India has been deliberately trying to frustrate, obstruct, and annoy the Chinese. And it will continue to do that until China changes its position along the line of actual control and goes back to the positions that it held before 2020. Same time, India is seeking to be more economically self-reliant, and that involves also trying to build up India's somewhat woeful, I think I'd probably say, defense industry. Some patches of excellence and things like missiles and so on, but not across the board particularly good. And then, of course, deepening partnerships with countries like Australia, Japan, and the United States, and so on. All right, so what does this mean? So here I'll go out on a limb on this. I'm not particularly controversial. You know, there's lots of other people arguing very similar sorts of things. The fact is that regardless of the state of Australia-India relations, okay, they could be great or terrible. They're pretty good though. It is good for Australia if India is reducing poverty, getting richer, is doing so in a more equitable fashion, if it's creating jobs, if it's taking on more of the manufacturing burden globally, if it's developing, if it's changing, and if it's dynamic. That is good for Australia regardless of the state of bilateral relations between the two different countries. That is just a good thing. We want India to be richer, stronger. We want it to be able to do what it wants to do, and we want it to be engaged in the international community, multilaterally, minilaterally, regionally, and everywhere else. I think we've made a decision, Australia have made a decision, I'm not speaking for Australia here, but I think I probably can safely do that. We made a decision 10, 15 years ago that this was the case, and I think that call was right. It was a good bet, notwithstanding some problems that we can probably talk about in questions and comments afterwards. The difficulty, though, is if this government decides that it's vulnerable and decides to, as I said before, tap right and double down on some of the identity politics. That's not so good. I don't think it's good for India, but I also don't think it's particularly good for the bilateral relationship. We've seen a taste of that in what has happened in the last couple of years in terms of tensions with the Sikh community in particular, and some of the issues around some elements of the Sikh community supporting Sikh separatism, the Palestine movement, and some elements of the Hindu community getting upset and angry about that, and there being a lot of tension between the two, and at the same time, alleged interference from the Indian government in Australia and in other places like Canada, the United States and elsewhere, the UK and so on, that has arguably made that problem worse and certainly made it difficult for governments like the one here to manage very effectively. So what we want to see is growing, confident, successful, so on. What we don't want to see is identity politics, because that is going to cause us problems directly, as well as arguably cause problems within India itself. And I think we are at a little bit of an inflection point here in terms of where India might go. I think, but I'd be really interested to see what other people think as well. So I'm going to leave it here, and we can go into questions and comments. Thank you very much again for the invitation to come and talk. Pleasure to see you all. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for finishing. So we got at least another 15 minutes of questions that we can go on. So as a prerogative, I've seen 2, 3, 4 hands. Let me take the opportunity to ask the first question if it's okay. You talked about China, the conscious constraint on China, but I've also noticed in the last 2 years, so not this year, the 2 years before, the trade between India and China has gone up by, the imports into India has gone up significantly by 65%. When you're talking 60, we're talking about, I don't know, maybe 70, 80, 90, $100 billion, and India is in big deficit against China. When the Western world has stopped getting into the 5G network, India seems to be getting into that. Just want to hear your view on that.
Yes, right. No, that's a really good point. So I think yes, trade between China and India has grown substantially post-COVID, or during the COVID period and afterwards. It was growing fairly substantially anyway, but it really has received a bit of a boost in the last couple of years for a variety of different reasons. The effect that has, so I think that's kind of just simply a natural thing. It's a function of India's growth, demand for things that are made in China. It's also a function of China's interest in some particularly raw materials, but other things that India is producing as well. So to some degree, this is just natural. As two growing economies are going to end up more interdependent. But it does pose some challenges. So on the one hand, you've got the conscious constraints on cooperation in diplomatic terms, but the economic interdependence also places constraints on confrontation. And that's one of the reasons why I think the Indian government is steering the course that it is. So on the one hand, it doesn't want a direct military conflict with China because China is that much more powerful militarily. At the same time, it doesn't want to risk the bilateral trade because the economic shock potentially for India could be quite significant. So it's steering this middle course between the two of kind of full engagement, which it thinks is risky, and at the same time full confrontation, which is also risky.
Thank you. Go for it,
Thank you, sir, for a great speech, presentation. So my question is very simple. So so many Western scholars and Western policymakers, they really wish to double down on India to be the continental power in the future as against to China. So my question is, can India really be that role? And even if India, gonna grow, reduce the profit, as you mentioned, is India really gonna be an ally to the West? So that's my question.
Okay, good question.
Yep.
So India will grow in its own way, at its own pace. It's not going to grow in the same spectacular fashion that China did. But it's still the case that even if India is growing at 6, 7, 8% per annum, and even if it's growing in an uneven fashion, that it's not creating enough jobs, it's not arguably doing enough manufacturing, that a lot of that growth is being fueled by infrastructure spending and construction and real estate speculation and all the critiques that there are of the Indian economy. Even if it's growing at 6, 7, 8%, it's still growing it's still going to end up as, well, by the end of this decade, it'll be the third largest economy in the world. It will continue to be the third largest economy in the world and growing and closing the gap, perhaps, with China over a 20, 30-year period, insofar as we can say that, make those projections, right? The second question is, so India is allergic to alliances, okay? And for good reasons, and some bad reasons in my view, but some good and bad reasons. It doesn't want to form binding relationships, make binding commitments with other states. So it doesn't want to say, if you're invaded, we'll come to your aid, and if we are invaded, you're going to come to our aid, and so on. Partly, though, it doesn't actually need that. So, to defend itself, India doesn't really need, the US Marine Corps up in the Himalayas, right? And also, the United States doesn't really need, in a confrontation with Taiwan, to have Indian ships sailing around in the Taiwan Strait. Right? What both sides need is the creation of a question mark in China's mind. Okay? That's what you want to do. The bet here is not that, that eventually India is going to wake up one day and say, do you know what we really need? We need a, South Asian Treaty Organization with the United States involved. Instead, the bet is that India will just follow and recognize its own interests, and it's simply in its own interests to grow and impose some of those constraints on cooperation with China and to be awkward to Beijing and to continue to create those question marks in Beijing's mind. So from our point of view, but certainly from Washington's point of view, they just want India to be India. And that's enough.
Thank you. I'm sorry, there's two more. Go for it. I'll come to you.
Thank you, Ian, for your good presentation. My name is Bharat. I'm originally from Nepal, next to Modi. Yes. And you haven't mentioned about the neighborhood policy of Modi government. This is very much serious issue because Modi has put SARC institution on defunct position now. and they have border issues with Bangladesh, Nepal, and China, and sometime with Bhutan as well. And don't you think that Modi's current government will be over next year if he doesn't address the neighborhood issues? Just he started now the traveling to Russia, and he has already made so many commitments there. And the other thing is the alliances. He doesn't want to have alliances overseas, with the countries in Asia Pacific, but he wants to have alliances within the country to run the government. So what is the difference, and what do you think that next year we'll see the new Prime Minister in India? In India.
Wishful thinking.
I hate making predictions, so I'm not going to get tempted down that path.
Yeah.
But I think that the neighbourhood is a very, very difficult thing to manage. Successive Indian governments have tried to improve relations with the neighbourhood, and then for a variety of different reasons, those relationships have broken down. Sometimes because of things that India has done that it shouldn't have done, and sometimes due to kind of actions beyond its control. But the neighbourhood is immensely important, obviously. It's important in security terms in particular. We can see that in the northeast. We've got an ongoing issue in Manipur at the moment, and it's not helped by, and it's being exacerbated by what's going on in Myanmar, in the civil war there, by the flows of weapons, people, drugs, money, all sorts of other things that are happening in that part of the world. And that just demonstrates, how problematic the neighbourhood is always going to be for India unless we can suddenly jump to a position in which we've got significantly higher levels of trust, significantly higher levels of economic interaction across South Asia, because remember, South Asia, as everyone always says, least economically integrated region in the world by quite a significant margin. And how we deal with all the diplomatic, issues and so on and so forth as well. So I would love to say, the Modi government came in and said neighbourhood first. That was its policy. We're going to deal with the neighbourhood first.
In the last one.
Yeah, in 2014.
Yeah.
And it had some successes. I think actually with Nepal, correct me if I'm wrong, the relationship actually improved a little bit for about a year or a year and a half or so. And then India did one of the things that it sometimes does, which is then there was a kind of dispute. Then there was this informal blockade of Nepal that prevented goods from going backwards and forwards. And all of the goodwill that had been lost was built up was lost. That story is just a story that happens over and over and over again. It kind of really repetition in this part of the world, and it'll take some different kind of thinking in order to make the kinds of changes that are necessary. And that's even saying that without mentioning Pakistan.
Yeah, it's included there.
Thank you about this.
Thank you. Thanks, Ian, for an amazing talk.
Thanks.
So you mentioned about India's position in the Quad. And, I think the Quad seems to change. It's a constantly iterating thing. But my perception of one of the things that the Quad is seeking to do is to position India for countries such as those in the Pacific as an alternative to China, as a leading South-South partner. And we've heard that echoed by Prime Minister Marape in Papua New Guinea. How credible is India as a partner for countries who are struggling to maintain their democratic resilience?
Yeah, so, yes. Really important question, and one that I know is being talked about a lot in both Delhi, but especially in Canberra, as it kind of tries to draw India in, and it has already made the decision to try to draw India more into these sorts of areas. I think, though, there's a recognition that India is just a different kind of development partner or assisting partner than China would be. So that India is not going to come in and build big flashy bits of infrastructure or a presidential palace and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it has done that in other, did that in Afghanistan, but that was a different kind of case. But what India is good at is in the democracy space. So India's for a long time run programs educating electoral officials And the Electoral Commission has programs where it brings people from a whole range of different countries into India, and then they train them on basics of security of ballot boxes. How do you make sure that you get the right kind of ink to, dip people's fingers in to make sure that, they vote. All that kind of practical stuff. India's been doing that for years, decades actually, and being really good at it. I think, so in areas like that, which are directly related to the questions about the resilience of democracies, India could make probably a significant contribution. I want it also to make a contribution in an area of one of Modi's pet projects, which is the International Solar Alliance, which is about, I don't really understand it because I'm not an economics person, but it's to do with raising the right kind of finance and getting the right sort of partners to build solar projects in equatorial countries. Again, India could make quite a big impact there, but I haven't seen a really substantive, well-grounded assessment of its success.
Thank you. I'll have.
Thanks. I listened to the podcast that the young ABC journalist that was effectively evicted or booted out of India before the election had done, called Looking for Modi. And there seems to have been a bit of concern in the lead up to the election that Modi has been moving towards more authoritarianism. Do you perceive that this election result reduces the prospect of that? And or if not, why not? Where do you think that's likely to head? And another a sort of related question: does India or Indians do the interest of Indians? Apparently, they seem to be entrepreneurial, capitalistic, interested in running businesses and making money and doing as well as they can. Is that also a bit of a bulwark towards or against further authoritarianism?
So I think on the second question, yes, probably, and I hope so. On the first question, that's actually quite an interesting thing. Look, authoritarian modes of politics are baked in to some degree into the Indian system. So we saw, obviously what was inherited from the British was a series of fairly authoritarian institutions and practices and norms and so on. And then on top of those, they've been extended, built upon, improved by other administrations too. There's a really good paper that's just been published in the Journal of Democracy that looks at this in some detail and makes the argument, which I think is right, which is that if we look across India since 1947, we can see widespread authoritarianism in state levels, particularly in the north, but not just in the north. And that what we've seen over the last 10 years or so is some of those methods, approaches, mindsets bubbling into the national system, but not for the first time, because this happened in the 70s. In fact, it happened in the 50s too. The hard bit is kind of assessing how much worse things have got and so on. I think it ebbs. My personal view is with Modi, it ebbs and flows. So when he's under pressure, as he was in the beginning of this year, the screws start to tighten, and then they're loosened a little bit, and they'll be tightened again. So, but to get the authoritarian out of the system would require a significant effort.
It's very difficult. Just 1 second, gentlemen. We got a question from the...
Professor, I've got two questions from online. The first of which is from our state president, Paul Lucas, which seems to follow on from the last question. To what extent has the election been a return to the traditional, albeit not the largest position of Congress? Or is it like Australia, where governments lose elections as opposed to, that is, oppositions don't win elections?
So yes, I think governments lose elections in India. And it's compounded by the anti-incumbency tendency of voters to like to swing backwards and forwards from one election to the other, which we see very much at state levels. It's very hard to go to be a second term, win a second term at state level in Indian politics. But that said, it's clearly the case that the government lost this more than the opposition won it. I don't think there was, and correct me if I'm wrong, anyone in the room, that there was a real groundswell of enthusiasm around Congress or around Rahul Gandhi. I think there was simply some good campaigns fought in different places, and there was some smart politicking that went on. But I think mostly Modi lost this rather than, I mean, he lost and he won. I wrote an article that said that. But, so he mostly lost rather than the other way around.
It seems to be a bit of a theme with other general elections this year. But,
Definitely.
the other question from Christopher Skinner is, to what degree will presumably India's reliance on Russia and other BRICS countries affect India's relationship with Australia? Would you be able to comment on that?
Yes. So I think the short answer is it's not going to affect it very much in the short term to medium term. The question is, what kind of relationship does India want to have with Russia over the longer term? Now, so at the moment, everybody appreciates in Washington, in Canberra, in London, wherever, right, in Tokyo, that India is locked into a dependent relationship with Russia on, particularly on defense technologies, and on some other niche things that it can't get anywhere else. Notably, nuclear power plants at a decent price and reasonable kind of way, and things like nuclear technologies for submarines, which, as we all know, are quite hard to get. So it is locked into those things. It's not going to shift away. It's kind of locked in also rhetorically, which is kind of, it didn't need to be, but that could change. But the bigger problem is that for the next 20, 30 years or so, they're going to find it extremely difficult to wean themselves off that defense relationship.
One question quickly from me, just bouncing off that, is that perhaps, you mentioned India not being able to access certain things like nuclear power, nuclear defense systems. Is that perhaps an avenue to curry favour with Indian administrations and Australia in any subsequent stage 2 AUKUS talks? Without going into.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think in the end that ball is very much in the American court. So, I mean, just as we know, the British were not able to transfer nuclear technology submarines to Australia unilaterally because they have to go to the Americans and ask permission, essentially. So, this all comes down to the United States. In terms of civilian nuclear power plants, the Americans did make a play actually to build more civilian nuclear power plants in India, but there were lots of political and corporate problems that came up there. And the French have also tried to do similar sorts of things, and again, India's gone back to the Russians for a variety of different reasons that, they're quite good reasons and some bad reasons as well. So I don't think there's a lot of leverage to be had there. The leverage is in some of the other areas, like, India needs a new air force, pretty much an entirely new air force. Now the French might be able to supply that, or some American things as well. Things like tanks, things like these sorts of things, arguably. But on those really big, high-level, complicated strategic things, that's where India is kind of locked into that relationship.
Thank you. Again, you've been putting your hand up for a while.
A question about so China and India, they both seemingly liberalized around similar times, but foreign direct investment has always lagged behind India compared to China. Why do you think that is, and is there any plan to somehow increase the FDI in India?
Yeah, so there was a little bit of lag in terms of liberalization. So we're talking about, India was about 10, 15 years behind or so. So you should always just kind of bear that in mind. But at the same time, India's still lagging even on that basis as well. This is part the investment question, and Raj knows much more about it than I do. I think is a function of, this is a complicated federal system, changeable governments. You've also, part of it, the political system is just complicated. There's not been the capital or the will there to build sometimes the infrastructure that's necessary, or to change the labor laws, or to provide labor, to provide land that the Chinese system is able to do. So there's issues there as well. And then there's also a little bit of again, there's not just an alliance allergy, there's also a little bit of a foreign investment allergy as well, because you've got to remember that, India has a painful historical experience of foreigners coming in and buying up Indian assets.
You would expect a benevolent dictator to be ruling India for 10 years to make the changes you're talking about. But it's not going to happen. But that's when the real changes will happen, because we had that in China. So if you go back to a little bit of history, America was against India for a very long time. Even during the Bangladesh war, when they were trying to support Pakistan, they had the 7th Fleet coming towards India. The Russian submarines stopped them. A bit of history there. So it's a lot of connections that happened there. And by India, Pakistan thing, US took the Pakistan side. So there's a lot of geopolitical thing that affected the economic thing. And India had the non-alliance policy, which probably brought them, they're not allying with either during the Cold War, either with Russia or with China, with the US. So it's all those things. And if you look at 1970, when President Nixon was beating his chest up, going to China, saying that I'm going to China, standing in front of the Air Force One, talking that I'm going to alleviate poverty out of 350 million Chinese. Now what it is, we can talk about it at a different time. But there are a lot of geopolitical history, and certain things gets economically tied up, which people are coming out of it slowly. Like Ian said, for the first question, it's a very tight line that people are walking in India to balance both Russia. India trades with Iran. None of us in Australia would trade with Iran, but India buys oil with Iran. The entire Iranian thing is held in Indian rupees for them to trade. So there's a whole lot of complications that happen. Anyway, any other questions?
Just adding on the China's alliance with Russia.
Yeah.
And India's reliance in Russia.
Yeah.
But what will be the impact of the Westerns on, what is the view of the Ukraine-Russia war? What will be in future?
Yeah, look, in short, I think, if you wanted to ask me why, say, Modi is in Moscow or he's just left Moscow, the principal reason for that is because they are deeply concerned in New Delhi that Russia and China will form a much more tight strategic partnership, and that will not be in India's interests even in the short term, but certainly in the medium to long term.
Okay.
So that anxiety is driving that outreach. There's some other stuff as well, but that's one of the reasons there. And in the end, though, what's changed in India in the last say 20 years is that now the major foreign policy problem is China and how to manage China. Prior to this, it was Pakistan. Prior to this, also the United States and American unilateralism and unipolarity and all those sorts of things. India was deeply concerned about that in the 1990s, but now it's all about China. And so you can read every move through the prism of China.
So it's getting to, I'll have two last questions. Keep it short. I'll have you ask and then I'll come to you. Please.
Thank you. Thanks, Ian. Could you talk a bit about the Muslim Indian population? What drives their voting behaviour? Is it the same sorts of things as Indians generally? You talked about urban-rural divide, economic development. Or does being Muslim trump those other things? Do they have a natural base in another party? What drives the Muslim?
Yeah, so interestingly, the received wisdom on this is that they will vote along their economic interests and social issues and schools and hospitals and jobs, right? One of the curiosities that the students of Indian democracy focus on a lot is why you don't see any kind of pan-Muslim coalescence across the states and across regions, and they're becoming a kind of significant political force, given that you're talking about 200 million odd people. And strangely enough, there's never been that coalescence. And that's one of the reasons, so for example, the Kashmir dispute remains a localized dispute, not a national dispute, as a consequence of that kind of, not inexplicable failure, but as a hard to explain failure.
Last question, please. Sorry. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, how is it reported in Canada, when the Trudeau government came out and accused India, we've had our own issues around coercion in politics, England. But I'm just wondering how it's reported in the Indian press of those types of incidents, and how does that go?
I can say a huge amount of things about this because I watched it very carefully. But there was enormous amounts of outrage in the Indian media about the accusation that Trudeau made. So this real upsurge of sort of anger and lots of how dare he and so on and so forth. It was balanced, if I can put it like this, with another message which was, but you know, that guy was a nasty guy and a terrorist, and so therefore bumping him off was a good thing. So there was a, you know, celebratory quality to some of the discussion as well. And I mean, I think that, so I could talk more about not just that case, but there's also multiple other cases and interesting cases as well. But there's this sort of sense. This is, you know, that's not an unexpected thing. I mean, I would like them to, you know, I'd like the media to respond in a different way, but it's not unexpected. You're talking about, again, a post-colonial society that doesn't like criticism from foreigners, especially from, you know, jumped up privileged white people like someone like Trudeau. And so it's predictable response.
Oh, thank you, Professor.
Sorry.
No, it's not good. One. Can we give him a... And I'm sure you know that by speaking here today, you've got 1 year free membership as a thank you from us.
Thank you.
So you're a member. I don't know if you're already a member.
I am a member, yeah.
Probably. Thank you. And we got some exciting events coming up. So we got one on the 23rd of July in this place, where we got Global Partnership for Local and Regenerative Climate Action by Dr. Connie Kairugan. So I think it's to be an interesting one to attend. And then on the 30th of July, again here, we have a presentation by Dr. Scott Waldron on the third-party plenum, China's economic trajectory and what it means for Australia. So we talked about India, we'll focus on China. And the next one would be on the 13th of August, which will be by our George Brandis, who was the Governor General, who was also the ambassador in UK. So he's going to be talking about UK politics, and that's going to be next door. So you're welcome. And thank you all for coming tonight, and thanks, Rachel, for allowing this place to be used by us. Thank you.